Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival from all of us here at Digi Palace front lawns, protected by Dettol. Today's session is presented by WSSO PHED Rajasthan. It's a pleasure to present Clearing the Air, Innovative Solutions for Pollution. Jyoti Pandey Lavakre, Alistair Lewis and Siddharth Singh in conversation with Anumita Roychowdhury. The pandemic has provided many parts of the planet a reprieve from the worst effects of pollution, demonstrating that the problem has solutions and is at least partially reversible. It's also served as a potent reminder that burning of fossil fuels is no longer feasible because the severe consequences and alternative measures are imperative for the survival of our planet. An important session that looks at the human cost of air pollution, be it natural or man-made, and the possibility of change. Jyoti Pandey Lavakre is a journalist, columnist, and author of Breathing Here is Injurious to Your Health, The Human Cost of Air Pollution, and How You Can Be the Change. Academic and author Alistair Lewis is a professor of atmospheric chemistry at the University of York and a science director at the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. Siddharth Singh is an energy, mobility, and climate policy expert. He was selected to be a German Chancellor Fellow in 2016-17 and is the author of The Great Smog of India. In conversation with Anumita Roychowdhury, the Executive Director, Research and Advocacy Center for Science and Environment, they look at solutions for clean air and discuss the potential for innovative political, economic, and social reforms that need to be addressed to make a credible impact on emissions and the quality and value of human life. Jyoti Pandey Lavakre is an independent financial journalist, author, and clean air evangelist. She started as a radio journalist in 1985 and switched from active journalism between 1990 to 2001 to writing columns for national and international newspapers after resigning from Dow Jones Newswires and a stint in California as a trailing spouse and stay-home mother. Alistair Lewis is a professor of atmospheric chemistry at the University of York and a director of the National Centre for Atmospheric Science. He's an experimental scientist who has studied the composition of the atmosphere and the impacts of pollution from polar regions to megacities, open oceans to tropical forests. He's currently chair of the UK Government Science Advisory Committee on Air Pollution. Siddharth Singh is an energy and climate policy expert currently working with an intergovernmental organization. He is the author of The Great Smog of India. Anumita Roychowdhury is Executive Director, Research and Advocacy at Centre for Science and Environment. She has helped to build the campaign on Right to Clean Air at the Centre that has contributed to several policy developments. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Clearing the Air, Innovative Solutions for Pollution, Jyoti Pandey Lavakre, Alistair Lewis and Siddharth Singh, conversation with Anumita Roychowdhury.
Welcome, everyone, to this very exciting session that has been designed as part of this 14th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival. And as you have just heard, the session is on clearing the air, innovative solutions, and for pollution. We have an exciting and amazing group of authors and change makers here for this conversation. And as you heard about everyone, I mean, there is excitement already bubbling up. And I am particularly excited about this conversation today because having spent now close to 2 decades fighting clean air battle in this country, I do understand the value of public conversation on air pollution. About 20 years, 25 years ago, having a conversation like this was so rare, so difficult. But the problem, even then, was big. In fact, air pollution was dismissed as dust from the desert. It was a challenge to distill science to communicate the problem. One had to invent and reinvent so many ways of connecting with people to join the dots. But we have come a long way since then. Now we have more voices articulating the concern, demanding change, and more important, breaking the bastion of expert speak. The fact that this conversation is happening on this platform of literature festival, and this shows that how the human story, which is so intrinsically linked with this public health crisis, has caught public imagination. And the narrative has matured, which is so important. There is a literary expression of this human story to look from the prism of personal connect, demystify science to inform and build perspective. So let's understand that this is so important that there has to be somewhere a personal and collective ownership of the concern and of the solutions. We have to build this conversation to empower public opinion, to influence and change politics around solution and make it all happen. So from that perspective, let's move on to have this very intense conversation. Let me first turn to Jyoti. And Jyoti, it was really amazing to read the book. And what struck me while reading your book is the expression of anger when your mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. And, and let me say that what this line that you have in your book, and let me read it, that my anger coalesces into smoldering, simmering rage, rumbling into a storm about to burst. You know, this resonates so well because we have always believed that it is this anger that has to touch heart to power change. And it is powerful to see that how you made that journey, that personal tragedy, that how you kind of, from that, you distill science, that you understood, you pushed doctors to explain to you. And, that's an amazing thing to happen. But more important, Jyoti, when I was reading this and your story emerging from this personal concern, that is the memory of this noted environmentalist Anil Agarwal, who had founded Center for Science and Environment and also who had cancer. And what he had written then, and it reminds me that it's a powerful writing that it was, that my story today and your story tomorrow. And now 20 years later, and I see what he had said, that we are all environmental victims. Cancer in our body reflects the cancer in the ecosystem. That's exactly what he has said. So, Jyoti, tell this story, tell this personal journey, that what compelled you to write this book, not as a journalist that you are by profession, but to capture this personal and human story. That's what we really want to hear from you today. Jyoti.
Thank you so much, Anumita. And I really am very grateful to everybody who's taken the time to read this book, because it is not a happy book. It is a book that talks of things that we don't really want to know about, we are in denial about. And I myself was in denial as well. And I wrote this book mainly for other people like me, because I feel it's very important for science to have a human face to it. What happens is, and you know, unlike all of you experts who chose air pollution to work in, air pollution chose me. I was born and raised in Delhi, and I had moved to California with my husband as a trailing spouse with two young children. We made an active choice to come back to India because I wanted my children to grow up knowing who they were, their sense of identity, spend time with grandparents, and all the usual reasons that people have for coming home. And very quickly, I found that there was something that was wrong that I hadn't noticed before. And a lot of people seemed to be falling sick all the time. And in the past, I did know about air pollution in an abstract sort of way at the back of my mind. But with two young children and friends, I had a lot of expat friends who told me that I was crazy to come back and what was I doing? And there's something toxic in the air. And yet the people I had grown up with, my friends, my childhood friends told me, oh, come on, you've become paranoid just because you've lived in the West. So, there was this confusion, was I overreacting or underreacting? And the only thing I knew as a trained journalist was to delve deep into that research and try and find out for myself what exactly was going on. And I was fortunate, I found other parents like me who were looking at science and evidence to see whether air pollution was indeed a problem. And some of us got together and banded and formed a platform called Care for Air. And one of the things we wanted to do was make other people aware, in very simple terms, what air pollution was doing to our bodies. Really connect the dots between air pollution and health harm. And that's how we started in about, I think, 2013 or 2014. But it was, like you said, in 2017 when my own mother got diagnosed with lung cancer, and the doctors attending on her were very blasé and seemed to sort of assume that I would know that this has been caused by, it has been triggered by air pollution. That's when I felt that it was important to tell this story as a personal story. Because as you know, and even as a journalist, I know that people relate to stories. Unless it isn't human and it doesn't affect me. When I start talking about climate change, for example, a lot of eyes will glaze over because people think, oh, climate change is like glaciers melting, the North Pole, the ice caps, all of that. They don't realize it's something that's happening here today. And with air pollution, it's exactly the same. Air pollution is killing all of us very slowly, very insidiously, and yet we don't know it. And that's why I felt it was important to write this book. It helped me also because it's part grief memoir. It really helped me to process all the feelings that I felt, because knowing about air pollution in an abstract way in your head is very different from knowing it in your heart when you see somebody you love suffering in front of you. Yeah. And so that was really the reason that sort of almost compelled me to write this book in this personalized format.
Absolutely, Jyoti. And what's very interesting, the book is the creative visualization of the whole idea of breathing. At the end of it, it's all about that. And the way this whole connection is made, breathing, not just with survival, but the creative expression, like you connected with the music and the songs of your mother. You connected with the way your father drew analogy with the long and the slow breathing in animals, and how breathing long and slow helps us live longer. And so it's kind of manifesting this whole idea and the breathe and the quality of air. And then it gets connected with the current crisis that we are going through, the pandemic crisis, and which the science is telling us that how, when we are exposed to air pollution for so long, that how that actually weakens our lung and makes us even more vulnerable to pandemic, the COVID. So that visualization of the science for public imaging, it's so important. So how do you want to reflect on that? Because you have made some reflection on what to learn from the COVID experience.
Yes, in fact, there's a whole chapter that I have on COVID. And I think some of the key things that COVID taught us was not just that, COVID is linked with places of high air pollution will have higher rates of COVID. All that science is there in the book. But I think I also wanted to reflect on the fact that I think for once people saw and experienced what we were only telling them. They saw clear blue skies. Because even for me, I had grown up in Delhi and mostly in Delhi, and you don't realize what color blue really is until you see it. And when I lived in California and I saw the different kind of dazzling sunshine and blue skies, and then I came back to Delhi, it was very different. And then suddenly Delhi during COVID and other parts of the country as well saw clear blue skies, dazzling sunshine. People saw the Dhauladhar mountain range. They saw sights they had never seen before, and only their grandmothers had told them about it. And suddenly they realized that everything about air pollution was true. And I think that was, to me, a very important side effect of COVID. The other thing that I found very important about COVID was that it showed us that there's a lot of air pollution that is man-made, anthropogenic. And so it can also be very quickly reversed. So I think that's very hopeful. I think that's a very good sign that although I don't think the way we want to reverse it is by lockdown, that is definitely not how we want to do it. But the point is that it can be done. And so there's a lot of hope that came there. The only thing I would say is the 4 things that I learned in the course of writing this book was that air pollution is not a Delhi or even a North India problem. 99.5% of India lives in areas that are not meeting WHO standards. I feel strange telling you are all experts and you know this so well, but I just tried to make it simple in the book. So I'm just going to tell it very simply. 1, it's not a North India problem, it's an all India problem. 2, it does not just affect our lungs, it affects every organ in the human body. So, whether it's dementia or depression or any sort of neurological issues, I wanted people to understand that. 3, I wanted people to know that this is a social inequity, because in the beginning, when we started talking about it, we were told, oh, this is a very elite problem. In fact, it's the opposite of an elite problem. I can surround myself with air purifiers, and people in privileged homes can do that and save themselves and their lungs from poor, dirty, toxic air. But construction workers, traffic policemen, auto rickshaw drivers, they can't just say that, okay, I'm not going into work today because the air quality is bad. So, those sort of purifiers and masks in any case are not a solution. They are just mitigants. We're just doing, we're trying to limit our exposure, and it's not reducing air pollution, as you all know. So I think these were the 3 or 4 things that I felt I needed to communicate to people like me.
Because in fact, that was really my next question for you, that, one thing is to build awareness around the problem. And now you really need a public outrage to push solutions.
Yeah.
And solutions that are just, that are equitable, and we can, that works for everyone.
Yeah.
But going forward, also understand that how challenging that is going to be.
Right.
And how do you really see that, how do we build that citizen science that is growing now, that it works for the solution, and also build public support for tough and difficult solutions going forward. In fact, I saw this in one poem that you have in your book, where you're actually saying that all this that is happening, the lung cancer, the stunted organ development, all because we drive our Mercedes. You even refer to the fact that your children, when they came back to India, that they had to unlearn walking and cycling. Now, these are part of the solutions, the lifestyle changes. So how can public awareness can be built and be leveraged to get that speed and scale of change that we are looking for?
So I think it's very important for air pollution and its health harm to become common conversation. That's why I wanted it to be part of our literature. I think it's important to be part of our films, of our music, games, everywhere. I think the day that every corner tea stall is, people in that tea stall are talking about air pollution. Like today they talk about corruption and poverty, and air pollution becomes another topic like that. Or in the addas where people are congregating, in any public conversation, until that day does not come, I don't think we will really achieve any great and large significant changes in air pollution. That's my view. But I think it's important for all of us to start. And one of the ways, like you say, yes, I find it hard to let my children cycle and walk in Delhi, and I don't have a death wish, and public transport sometimes can be very unsafe. But we can do things like composting at home, and I've been doing that for 4 years. It's really dead easy, and it's so satisfying. There are so many other things we can do. If you have the ability to go electric, we switch to electric cars. Take even in our school, there is I think an entire episode in the book where we show how we tried to move school children in my children's school from about 650. We moved made it almost 1,350 children and doubled the number of school buses. I think all these things are important, and as citizens, we have to hold our governments accountable and our corporates. I think lazy citizens make lazy governments, and unless we are not vigilant, unless we don't vote with our ballots and our wallets, I don't think change will come. And that's the only thing that I feel we as individuals have, because otherwise the problem can seem extremely overwhelming.
Right. That's Jyoti, just hold that, and I'm going to come back to you.
Sure.
So I'll now quickly go to Siddharth. So, to continue this discussion on how people can connect with the problem and own the solutions. So, your book about the Great Indian Smog, right? It kind of, where you really made that effort to demystify science of the problem and bring out the systemic issues that have bearing and on air quality, influence air quality and public health risk. So your book brings out, that the early battle, and I'm so, when I was reading it, when I saw that you mentioned Slow Murder, the book that we have done in 1996, and I had also co-authored that book. It brought back so many memories of those very intense early battles that we had to fight them. But, at the same time, from that perspective, let's first, what you have in the book, that you have tried also to use and, as I said, demystify science for people to understand that what is this pollution all about. And it's interesting to see that, how you have looked into the meteorology, you have talked about that, scanned that science to explain to people that what's the regional differences in air pollution, that how and why, despite having common sources of air pollution, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, they tell a different story. And that there is divergence between our cities and our villages. And yet we are all facing this problem. And 99% of Indians are not even breathing air quality that meets the WHO guidelines. So kind of first reflect on this aspect of taking science to people to explain to them.
For sure. Thank you, Anumita. I think, Jyoti set the stage quite very nicely in terms of understanding how the impact of the personal with the environment is so strong. And I think, firstly, congratulations also to Jyoti for authoring this book. In fact, had Jyoti's book come out earlier, I probably would not have needed to write the one that I wrote, because, when I started researching for the book, let me actually take a step back from that. I had no intention of writing the book. I actually just wanted to read a book on air pollution. I just wanted to understand what's happening in the country. So I realized very quickly that no such book exists, at least none that could be appreciated by somebody with a more interdisciplinary, need to understand the world. Somebody who, may not have the scientific, knowledge to decipher some of the terminologies used. So at that point, I realized that the only way I can understand about the problem is if I started reading the things that my colleagues were writing, the things that my, the people in the scientific community were writing. So we, in that period, I used to work, previously at the Energy and Resources Institute, after which I was in Germany, where I was researching with the Energy and Climate Institution based in Berlin. So there were a lot of excellent material coming out from my colleagues, from the scientific community at large. And that kind of really helped me understand the nature of the problem. But again, it was such that it was, I guess, distributed or divided into so many different niches that it really needed, I think, an effort to put all of this together so that to the average reader or to the average citizen, they'd be able to make sense of what was happening. Just to kind of pick up on a few of the I guess academic streams under which air pollution falls. A lot of subjects are very I guess not, I wouldn't say restricted, but they are largely tend to be in the realm of that particular academic field. But in the case of air pollution, you could approach it from the scientific understanding of, say, chemistry or physics, where you understand how particulate matter behaves, or you could approach it from meteorology or geography to understand how particulate matter flows within regions, or how the atmospheric changes impact air quality levels in certain places. You could approach it from an economic angle to understand why industries are locked into certain forms of practices, or why and from a political economy perspective, to understand what you need to kind of bring the change and to transform the need of the people to kind of act on something like this. You could approach it from a legal angle, where you try to understand the laws and how the polluter pays principles, or the other aspects of laws that kind of impact action. So there are various ways to approach this problem, and I think my effort was to bring together all of this, but in a manner that can be read by people in the manner that it is a story, rather than somebody preaching or somebody throwing too many technical or jargony points at you. And I think that is what the effort here was. And of course, happy to talk through each of these, but I think that was the general idea.
Yeah. Absolutely, Siddharth. So in fact, what is interesting that you do talk about the solutions, and it's interesting to see that how you actually focused on the energy transition, mobility transition, the connect with agriculture, and how we need to find the deeper connect in all these sectors to be able to have a multi-sector strategy to clean up the pollution from the source. And I really like this idea that the term that you coined is the energy trilemma, right? To provide affordable, consistent, and environmentally sound energy to the masses. Right? But at the same time, the questions that I have is that clearly to enable that, the devil is in the detail of the policies. So where do you think are the missing links in the government's ability to address the policy gaps, deal with infrastructure deficit, skill gaps, and even all the pricing and the taxation distortions, which you actually say that in the energy sector, if we can address that, we can actually tip the scales away from coal, all right? So it's such a multifaceted, approaches and the solutions that you require that, yes, the experts do discuss that quite a bit, but the challenge of taking the same idea and the issues to the masses, to the people. So how would you want to respond to that? And so one is that top level policy approaches, and then what's playing out at the grassroots. So would you like to reflect on that?
Yes, of course. No, I think that's an excellent question. I think in India, in general, there are two schools of thought, at least two schools of thought from my conversations with various experts. So one is that, India needs a reformation of the laws. India needs a reformation of the legislative landscape and the regulatory kind of, mechanism and institutions that exist. And once we are able to transform these institutions, we'll be able to kind of address the problem. The other school of thought, and this is the one that I kind of lean towards, is that for all its imperfections, India still already has the necessary laws, the necessary regulation, at least at the top. What India really lacks is the implementation of things that already exist. So even without trying to reinvent the wheel, if we were able to just implement the things that already exist, implement the laws and the regulation that already exist, I think we'd be able to go a long way. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need to tweak, our regulatory landscape and so on. But I think this itself would kind of push us towards action. So, in my understanding, in my dealing with right from the ministries at the top to the state pollution control boards, at the bottom of this food chain of action in this realm, I have noticed that the technical skill or the access to the technical skill at the level of the ministries is quite excellent, in the sense that they are able to access the work of this ecosystem of people, both globally as well as within India, to understand the specific aspects of problem, which admittedly, even though we think more needs to be done, I have seen that in other countries as well, the nature of the knowledge or the nature of what we know and what we don't know is about the same. So it's like I don't think we should beat ourselves too much over that. I think what the biggest problem is how we are able to act against, or rather, polluting sources which may be legal or illegal. Because again, not all pollution is illegal. We should not assume that the pollution is happening necessarily only by industries that are flouting norms. It's also happening legally by, for example, people who may want to warm themselves up on a cold wintry night, and you use biomass to burn because that's what you can access, right? So not all forms of air pollution is illegal. But in the specific case of this illegal air pollution, let's give the example of a state pollution control board, specifically the Haryana State Pollution Control Board, which I've had the chance to interact with. So just think about the nature of the challenge here. This institution is in charge of implementing all the norms that are made in Delhi. So the norms and regulations and so on are made in Delhi and the capitals. And these are people who are at the grassroots. There's a 70% shortage of staff in this institution. So among the 30% of the people that exist, they basically have no time to actually go out there and do the necessary audits, do the necessary kind of action that you would need to do on the ground. They are unfortunately too mired in the bureaucratic kind of writing minutes of the meeting, stuff like that, and therefore they're not able to adequately act. Secondly, they have no access to funds, and they are chronically underfunded. In fact, there is no budget within the ministry, within the government, that is allocated for environmental action. They get their money through giving out the no objection certificates to industries, for the right to pollute. So similarly, they are given charge of institutions that have nothing to do with air pollution or pollution of any form. For example, the Haryana State Pollution Control Board also has poultry farms under its ambit. So, here are people who are supposed to be looking at air pollution, but instead they're inspecting poultry farms. This actually became quite a serious issue because the avian flu was around the time of the winter smog season just a couple of months ago. And finally, you're expecting engineers to write legal papers that will be tested in a court of law, and it's very easy for the opposition, the polluter side, to find faults, because of course an engineer has no training in law, and therefore it's very these court cases are basically lost very easily. This is the kind of
therefore, Siddharth, taking cue from what you have just said, you in your book, you have also reflected on this whole Make in India, and how much traction that's now got in the post-pandemic, now with all the economic recovery on the table, that whole conversation around that. Now, so this localization agenda, and that's certainly getting stronger, but happening also at a time when the environmental safeguards are being lowered. And there is therefore this constant tension in the conversation that how do you set the environmental boundary of development? And even the counter view that should India, with this poverty burden, unemployment burden, how can it invest so much resources on environmental safeguards or something like air pollution? But of course, you also have this line in your book that you made this observation that if the policies ignore either of them, the development or environment. I mean, you really cannot make it either or. And if you do that, then this will not be sustainable. It's going to harm all. So how do you address that challenge, this constant balancing when we know that public health has to override everything? So how would you respond to that very quickly?
Yeah. No, so I think that's an excellent point. Basically, there's this big debate on how countries like India, we have lower than the world average of per capita indicators on so many different things, including, of course, incomes and energy consumption, emissions, you name it. India is below the world average on per capita levels, and therefore there is a need for India to grow. There's a need for India to be able to bring the millions of people out of poverty, and I think that's a very important thing. I'll give you a very small example of how this debate between development and environmental action sometimes manifests itself. So in the year 2000, when the Supreme Court basically made a ruling that the some of the industries in residential areas around Delhi will have to shut down and relocate to some other place. The need for this was apparent because there were people who were suffering very badly from the air pollution that was coming out in those regions. There's a basically dilapidated, almost hellish industrial landscape. And yet, when that happened, the result of that wasn't people cheering for it. We actually had riots in the streets of Delhi where 4 people lost their lives in the violence. Buses were burned down because people did not want industries to leave the residential areas of Delhi, because of course people were working, people depend on the livelihood of that. Therefore, understanding that, we need to understand that when we act, we're able to act in a manner that does not cause discomfort or dislocation of the people who may be reliant on that, and we have to work in a manner that basically helps them transition also. Now I'll give you 2 or 3 very quick examples of how we have been able to do this without causing pain, and therefore these are the kind of examples that we should pursue more of. For example, India has the LED, the Ujjwala scheme for LED bulbs, and so not Ujjala for LED bulbs, and they have distributed about, or rather ended up selling over between 30 to 60 crore LED bulbs in the country, which has led to the avoidance of the peak demand of up to 10 gigawatts of power, which means that about 10 coal-fired power plants somewhere in the country should have existed, but don't exist right now because people have moved to higher efficient bulbs. Similarly, there's a scheme for perform achieve trade in the case of industries, where again, because of action by the industries, not only have they been able to reduce emissions, but they're also reducing energy use, which has led to monetary savings for these industries. So therefore, the industry is actually on board with such change. So I work right now at the International Energy Agency, and we just co-authored this major publication just a couple of weeks ago called the India Energy Outlook, where we estimate that, in fact, by investing into clean energy technologies, India can create up to 1.5 million new jobs over the next 20 years. So these are good quality, safe jobs, which also lead to reductions in emissions and energy use. This is the kind of approach we need so that we are able to manage both the economic needs as well as the environmental action agenda.
That's a great point, Siddharth, because that's exactly the kind of green recovery that we are looking forward to. So it's a green recovery, but a just recovery at the same time. And we do have the means and the ways of doing it. And these are great examples that you have shared. So I'll come back to you, Siddharth, but let me now quickly go to Alistair. You are the voice from the other side of the world. And it's so clear today that we are all in it together. And it's so interesting for us to watch this whole air pollution story unfolding globally. And for such a long time, we had this impression as if developed world has fixed the problem. But now we realize how much more nuanced that story is. Yes, you have to some extent, because you do not experience London smog or Pennsylvanian smog anymore, the kind of Delhi smog that we have here. But at the same time, when every year we look at the global burden of disease data, it is also quite clear that the death numbers in the developed world is still notable. And today in London, you do have clean air movement, that there is quite a strident movement. And therefore, and what is so dramatic, particularly this recent development, and we have to take cognizance of that fact, that when, for instance, in Jyoti's book, I saw this mention in a letter to the Prime Minister, this sentence, that death certificate may never state air pollution as the cause of death. But we all know that exactly that happened in United Kingdom in 2020, that the case of Ilya Kisidebra, right? That for the first time, the death certificate actually said that air pollution is cause of death. So, looking at from that prism, just want to understand from you that global learning curve, that how similar or different are air pollution problems in other cities around the world, and then we'll come to what we can learn from that. But please go ahead first, give us that sense of how it is there.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to this excellent event. So I mean, I grew up outside of London, and although I don't live there anymore, I mean, London lays claim to being sort of the world leader, if you like, historically on air pollution, and it probably had claim to being the most polluted city in the world for maybe 150 years. And it's only in the last perhaps 30 to 40 that the problems come under control. And in fact, if you travel around the world, and I'm very lucky to work with scientists all around the world on air pollution problems, there are hardly any large cities, wherever they are around the world, that don't have a problem still with air pollution. So, I mean, it's quite right to talk about the personal view that Jyoti has and Siddharth's view at the national level, but actually these same conversations are going on all around the world in different cities. Very few places have solved the problem. And the very few large cities that actually get underneath the World Health Organization limits tend to have the weather on their side. They tend to be remote cities that are in very wet and windy places. So it is a global problem. I mean, I think there's quite an interesting change in how the issue is being addressed. And certainly when I started my scientific career, a lot of the emphasis was on describing the problem. Whether that's describing the problem in London or Beijing or Paris or New York, we were very focused on saying how bad things were. But I think in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a really significant shift to talking about what the solutions are scientifically, that we don't need to keep redefining the problem. We need to move on now to say, how are we going to do it? So what can we learn from international work? Well, the first thing is that everybody has the same problem, but not everybody has the same set of solutions. And this is why every country and every city needs to look carefully at its own air pollution issues and design solutions to fix them. And this is why skills is so important. Every city and every country needs to have the skill to diagnose its own problem and diagnose what the right solutions to those problems are. So, for example, in London, we've gone through a period of very high levels of pollution from the pollutant nitrogen dioxide. That was the key pollutant. If you move to a city like Delhi or Beijing, the problem is probably overwhelmingly particulate matter. So it's different. So we mustn't sort of import solutions from one place to the other. Everybody needs to study. But to do that, there is this huge growth now in international collaboration on ensuring that we can bring all the science and technologies that we've got to diagnose those problems. So I think we're learning pretty fast now, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from looking at other places.
Absolutely, Alice. In fact, in that context, you had made this very interesting observation when we had a conversation earlier. And what you mentioned was that the air pollution historically has been a poor relation to climate change as a global priority, right? And just want to understand how's that playing out, and how, and keeping the two in mind and this kind of the way the priorities are playing out. So how the different communities, cities, governments, how they're responding to that crisis, and what is that learning curve that we really need to understand? But what more important, how do we learn from the success and the failures that we have seen in different regions of the world?
So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to look at how the two issues of climate change and air pollution have developed, and of course they are closely linked, but they are subtly different in their effects. And certainly, I feel that in a lot of, I think, Western Europe, that for a long time climate change was seen as the number one issue, And of course, it's hugely important, but it was seen as very much a priority amongst academics, amongst the political decision makers, amongst green and environmental lobbying groups. And I've reflected a bit on why that might be. And I think it's possibly that air pollution tends to affect the most disadvantaged the most, and the ones that have potentially the least amount of voice in the discussion. Whereas I think to people who've had a good education, who have some money, climate change does look like a really big threat, not only to you, but to your children and your children's children. Whereas air pollution tends to have been something that was going to affect the poorest in society and the most marginalized. But I think that has changed now. And I think it's changed because people have begun to see that some of the solutions to climate change are actually solutions to air pollution. And that climate change is such an enormous problem for the world to grapple with. And some of the benefits of investing in climate change might not be seen for 100 years. But the benefits of investing in climate change actions, as Siddharth has described some of them, like low energy bulbs, very practical things, may feed through almost immediately into public health benefits. And that maybe we need to look at the two problems together, that if I'm going to be faced with an intervention that's possibly motivated by climate change, I would be better off thinking about it as an air pollution solution. And I might get those benefits pretty quickly. So I think the pace of change it has sped up. No city now expects to be polluted for 150 years anymore.
Absolutely, Alistair, because that's the core benefit framework that today we need to guide our action. And from that perspective, Alistair, I know this is a fascinating work that you have done during the pandemic, and which has is a very scientific study that you have carried out, and your real world experiment to understand that the real change that we saw during the lockdown, the hard lockdown with all the restrictions around, that what do we really learn from that? And the fact of the matter is that, that was forced change, and the same change that we will have to achieve with actual systemic solutions. But at the same time, the pandemic has really caught imagination, the blue sky that Jyoti talked about. And, yesterday, let me tell you that we had also put out our new State of Environment report. And in that, when we reported that in India now, we are going to have this new pandemic generation, that about 375 million children will suffer poor health, educational losses. Now, that's what has caught the imagination all around. One, the blue sky that is possible, and yet the pandemic generation. So from your science and the big fall in pollution that you saw during pandemic, so what do we learn from there? How do we prepare for the new normal?
So I think we'll learn an awful lot. I think the science of this is only just starting. There's a lot of analysis to be done. But I think it's telling us that the way that the atmospheres in individual countries and individual cities responded tells us something about what the best solutions are in those locations. So the way that cities, for example, like London, responded to coronavirus and travel restrictions was very different to how, for example, Delhi responded. So in Delhi, large increases in visibility, large improvements in particulate matter were seen, almost transformational changes. In London, much less so, but big changes in other pollutants. And so we're getting some insight into what are the key drivers. We're getting a real life experiment, if you like. It's not a theoretical calculation of what effects we might get if we changed the transport fleet or we changed industry emissions. We're getting some real live data on that. And I think that's going to be very, very influential, not only in mobilizing people to demand cleaner air because they've seen it and they've smelt it and they know that it can happen, but I think it gives a lot more confidence to decision makers. Sometimes dealing with air pollution may well involve unpopular decisions or expensive decisions. And, politicians are perhaps nervous about making those decisions without being really confident that they're going to get benefits that people will want. And I think that's maybe where the pandemic changes things. It may embolden decision makers to say, I think this will be a popular decision and I'm going to make it because I'm pretty confident that it will have a beneficial effect. So let's see. It may play out, I think, in different ways in different locations, but I think for sure the pandemic has changed thinking on air pollution.
I know. We can just go on and on, but I'm already getting signals that, we are kind of running against time. But that's great insight. And I can see the chat box flooded with questions. So before we open up the question and take few questions, Jyoti, would you like to read out a couple of few lines from your book?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for reading the book so closely, Anumita. I can see you've gone through it. I'm going to read a very short piece from the epilogue. It's called Epilogue. Actually, the entire book, the contents, if you join up the title of the contents, you will find a message in the book, like a message in a bottle, and I'm not going to tell you what it is so that people actually read it themselves. I will never see my mother again, hear her melodious voice practicing her musical dance, except in my dreams. Then, over time, as my friend Anjali, who lost her beloved father to lung disease and was quietly shattered by it, says, I will be afraid of forgetting details. I know I'm not alone in mourning someone lost to a cause that can be linked directly to the foul air we breathe. Every day, I come across more and more people who are suffering from lung disease, cancers, fibrosis, strokes, cardiac disease, and so many other diseases that are triggered by air pollution. Friends whose mother's lungs were found to have fluid, whose fathers suffered a cardiac arrest soon after Diwali, non-smoking neighbors who got a sudden severe lung infection in the North Indian winter, elderly relatives who were admitted to hospital for a broken hip after a fall, but passed away from lung infection. I never wanted to be an activist. I am not a pollution expert, scientist, public health researcher, or epidemiologist. I never set out to be an environmentalist. I think of myself simply as a survivor, an aware, informed, and vigilant resident of Delhi who is trying to survive Delhi's poor air amongst its other urban challenges. Diwali used to be a time when I prepared my house for festivities and opened it up to friends and families. But now it is a time when I start worrying about the air quality and start shuttering my home to the outside air, duct taping each window carefully in order to protect my family. That sinking feeling in my heart usually begins after Dashera, just before the bright winter sunshine of my childhood withers to a dull, dystopian gray, when stepping out of the door makes my eyes water. Every so often, I have a sudden memory of another sky, a clear, bright blue of crisp winter mornings. Back then, I could enjoy the beauty of an orange-pink sunset without haze obscuring my view. Now, I worry that I will grow old in the dim haze of grey Delhi winters, the winter of my own life, overshadowed by the debris of diseases triggered by pollution, my few remaining friends suffering with me, those who can get away forced to scatter. I know many others feel the same way, those who have known a different Delhi, who still have fleeting memories of that long vanished sky. Delhi's toxic pollution has become much more than an environmental problem for me. It is now an existential crisis that clings to me like a dull, aching sadness.
Thank you so much, Jyoti. That was really wonderful. But now, as I see that, we have really come to an end of this session. And so we have many questions, and we'll see to it that, we get these questions to you and you give your reflection. And we will certainly share your answers with all of them. And so now that we are coming to a close of this wonderful, such an intense discussion that we really needed, just one line, the end note from each one of you, but very quickly, just we have got 2 minutes to say that how do we build the mass movement and build this public conversation more to energize change and solution? Just one line each. Yes. Yes, Siddharth?
Sure. I mean, I guess if there's just one line, I would say that please read the manifestos before elections and vote. That's the one thing that you should be doing to make sure that you're voting for a party that works towards environmental action.
Great message. Yes, Alistair?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that we should be demanding change wherever we are in the world. There is the science and there is the engineering and the technology to begin to solve the problem. Not overnight, but maybe in a few years to 10 years in most places around the world. And we should start to demand that as one of our highest priorities.
Absolutely. Jyoti, the last word goes to you.
Thank you. I just think that clean air is a fundamental human right, and we must ask for it and not stop asking for it until we get it. We have our wallets, we have our ballots, and we need to use them with awareness and mindfulness. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jyoti, Alistair, Siddharth, great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you, Alistair, Siddharth Singh, Anumita Roychowdhury for that wonderful session. And we do know that there is a possibility of reversing pollution. We've seen the changes in the Yamuna and Delhi, which completely turned clean during the pandemic and the lockdown. And of course, the skies were absolutely wonderfully blue. We thank WSSO PhD Rajasthan for presenting the session. We thank our celebration partners, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a fabulous audience. Just to remind you, you can keep going between Front Lawns and Darbar Hall, and of course continue watching our programs for the next few days. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted. We do need your support, so please do press that contribute button and press it now. Anything that you can give us at Teamwork Arts, we really appreciate it. Remember to log on to the Amazon book site to order up your books, and of course there's Earth Fables for anything that you desire in the world of craft. Do remember to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021, and our handles are at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival and all of us are protected by Dettol. Stay safe, stay protected.